Hello and welcome. In this video, we will learn about server versus client components in Next.js and what are the best practices we should follow while using server and the client components in Next.js. So let's get started. So what exactly is a server and the client component? To demonstrate that, what I can do, I have this empty Next.js page. Basically, I have just created this project and I have just replaced the homepage contents with this homepage div. Okay, that is all. Now if I just do a console log and then do something like home page, something like this, if I just save that and go to the browser, okay, so now as you can see, this is our console log and we have a label which Next.js provides. Okay, so it is providing this label that is server. And if we go to our terminal, okay, if we go to our terminal right now, as you can see, we have this console log there. So all of the console logs which are inside of the terminal is coming from the server components. So if you do a console log inside of a server component, what will happen? The console log will appear inside of the terminal where your development server is running. Okay. Or what will happen is that we will have this label, right, of servers. So we can see inside of the browser, okay, this is coming from a server component. All right. And by default, all of the components which we create inside of Next.js are server components. Okay, so I hope that is clear. So server components always renders on the server. Okay, and that is why we are getting the console log right inside of the terminal, because the server component always renders on the server. So that is why we are getting the console log inside of our terminal here. Okay, I hope that makes sense. Now let's create another component and let's call it a child component .tsx. Okay, let's create the component here, and here what we can do, we can have a button. Okay, and then I can do a click me, and if I just do the on click here, on click, okay, there we go. And here what we can do, we can do a just a console.log, okay, of click. All right, now we have the child component here. Now what I'll do, I will just import the child component, import child component from here, and inside of the div, okay, I'll just render the child component. All right, I hope that makes sense. Now if we go to the browser right now, we will get an error which is saying like, hey, button has the on click and the functionality of this on click is not available inside of a server component. So we have to convert the child component to a client component. Okay, so how we can do that? We can just go ahead here and use the use client directive. Okay, and the error is now gone and we have the button. I am using tailwind CSS, that is why there is no styling in the button, but yeah, this is a button. Now as you can see, when I click, so we have this console.log and it is coming from a client component. That is why there is no label of server here. Okay, all right, so this is the client component here. But one thing which I want to show you here is that if I do a console log right now here and do something like child component and save. Now if I go to the browser, as you can see, we are getting the console log. I'll just do that and I'll just refresh. Okay, now we are getting this console log. So inside of the browser, And also, if you go to the terminal right now, we are getting that particular console log here as well. Okay, so one other thing to keep in mind while using client component is that client component at first renders on the server and then it renders on the client side as well. Okay, and that is why we have these on clicks and so on and so forth available inside of our client component, right? So client component at first renders on the server and then it renders on the client side, okay, inside of the browser. So this is the client component. Now the main confusion happens when we nest the client and the server components. Okay, so to demonstrate that, what I'll do, I will create another component. Okay, so client component dot tsx. Okay, this is my client component. Okay, now what I'll do, I'll just do a use client here. Okay, so this component is by default the client component. Okay, and we have this child component here. I will just get rid of this button and on click, and I'll just do something like child component. Okay, and I will get rid of this use client as well. So it is currently a server component, and I can show it to you as well. As you can see, we have this label, and inside of our terminal as well, if we go here, we have these console logs. Okay, awesome. Now we have the client component here, and what I'll do, I will first import the client component here, and after the child component, I will render the client component. Okay, now I have rendered the client component here like that. So inside of the client component, I'll add a console log of client component. Okay, and this will become handy in a minute. So if I just go here, so we are having, I'll just refresh that. So we are having 3 console logs, 2 from the server components. Okay, so the child component is a server component, home page is a server component, and we have the client component here. All right, now what I want to wrap our child component, which is the server component. Okay, so I can do child server component. Okay, and I'll just copy that. Okay, so we can do that, right? We can do that. So I'll just go ahead and do server as well, server component and server component. Okay, so it will be clear for us. Okay, so now if I just go here, as you can see, we are having the console logs here. So homepage, and then we have the child server component and we have the client component. Now what I want to wrap the child server component inside of a client component. Okay, and we do this quite often. If you want to have some sort of an auth provider or some sort of an theme provider inside of your application, you usually use a provider which is a client component, and inside of that, like inside of the layout, basically you nest all of the components inside of that particular provider. So I want to do that. So I'll do this and then do this. Okay, and inside of that, what I'll do, I'll just cut this one. Okay, and paste it down here. All right, now it is complaining because we want to have the children. So children, and this has to be children of React node. Okay, and I'll just import that. And here inside of this div, I'll create another div, and inside of that we can just children. Okay, render the children. All right. So now what is happening here? To recap, we have the client component. Inside of that, we are rendering our server component. Now, my question to you is, will this particular structure, what we are doing currently here, we are doing component composition, basically, will that make our server component a client component? And if it makes that, then what is the benefit of using something like Next.js, right? Because if you add a theme provider or something like that, and inside of that you have the whole thing, whole application of yours, then will that make every component a client component in that part? So let's see that. So if I just go to the browser currently right now and refresh, now, as you can see, it is not making our child server component a client component because it is having this server tag or this server label here. Okay, so our child component, which is a server component, stays the server component. Okay, so if we do something like this, if we do component composition, then all of the client components will be a client component and all of the server components will stay server component, right? So in that way, we are having the full benefit of using something like Next.js. Okay, so here it is. So we have this particular syntax right now. So if we do component composition, something like this, then all of the components which we are passing as the children, if that is a server component, will stay as server component, and if that is a client component, will stay as client component. Okay, now we are rendering the children server component, right? So if I just go ahead inside of the browser currently right now, so we are having this client component, and after that we have this child component. Okay, now we can do something similar as well. So if I just get rid of this child server component here, and if I just do this, just render this one, and I will go to the client component here, and we do not need the children anymore. Instead of that, we have this use client directive here, right? So instead of this one, I will directly import the child server component. So server component here. Okay, and instead of rendering this children, I will render the child server component. Okay, so this will have the similar results on the UI, but if we go to the browser currently right now and refresh, as you can see, our client component is there, but our server component became a client component because we are not having that particular server label here inside of the console log, right? So our child server component is becoming a client component if we do something like this. Okay, so if we just import a server component inside of a client component and then render that particular component, then what will happen? This server component and all of its children components as well will become a client component. So we should totally avoid this sort of scenarios inside of our code. Okay, so it is not a best practice. So if we want to pass a server component to a client component, we should use the previous method where we were using the component composition, right? We were using the component composition where we were wrapping this client component over a server component, and our server component always stays as the server component. Okay, it is not being changed. But if we import a server component inside of a client component and then render that, then what will happen is that our server component will become a client component. Okay, so what is the best practice to use that? So you should use as much as component composition, where you are passing the children and you are wrapping the client components over server components or client components. And also you should make your components granular. Okay, so if you are having a button inside of this server component, for example, right, if you are having a button, then just extract that particular button to its own component and make that particular button a client component, and then use the component composition. Okay, so in that way, what will happen, you will follow the best practices, you will have the full control over your components, and you are getting all of the benefits which Next.js provides to us. So here I hope that this particular discussion is totally clear to you and you have a better understanding of the client and the server components inside of the Next.js, and in the upcoming projects you will follow the best practices which we have discussed inside of this particular video. So this is the server versus client components in Next.js.